So again, going back to personality, so this is essentially where a number of researchers, including Raymond Cattell, have used factor analysis to identify the personality traits that best describe people. Okay. And that's, again, so Raymond Cattell. Taking an empirical approach. If you remember, we talked about the empirical approach to measurement and assessment. The idea being you're not necessarily starting with any preconceived notions about what personality is like. You're just basically starting out with whatever the language has to provide for you. So it's got 171 different trait names, I guess from a dictionary, pretty much. And he then took these and translated it into he ran a factor analysis essentially, and from these items reduced it to 16 factors. So it took the large number piece of information, translated into a smaller number, 16 primary factors of personality. And in fact, there is a questionnaire called the 16PF, which asks people to respond to these 16 items. Well, let's see what these items are. So the factors that he defined, those 16 factors, were warmth, reasoning, emotional stability, dominance, liveliness, rule consciousness, sociableness, etc., all the way down to tension. And the descriptors, kind of on one end of the continuum to another, represent, how people would score on each of these. So you could be on the one end being reserved, or on the other end being warm for factor 1. For factor 2, you can be on the one end a concrete reasoner versus an abstract reasoner, and anywhere in between. And again, so that your responses to these would essentially identify where you are on each of these 16 factors. Bottom line is, Cattell's research identified 16 pretty much unique factors of personality. What we're going to talk about a little bit later is we're seeing that the 16 factors is probably not quite accurate, in that probably there is actually less than 16, and that you could probably group some of these factors that you're seeing here together. And this reflects, as we're getting close to the 5-factor theory, Costa and McCrae, the big 5 personality traits, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so one approach to studying personality. Another approach to studying personality comes from Hans Eysenck. And his approach basically starting with the idea that there are 3 basic components of personality: introversion, extroversion, emotionality versus stability, and psychoticism. Although psychoticism, not much research on this particular area. But basically, he viewed personality coming from these 3 perspectives. This is essentially, so in other words, looking at past research on personality, past theory, he determined that these 3 particular super traits can more or less define who we are. Now, if you want to measure these particular super traits, you can, this can be identified in a number of different individual traits, which lead to habitual responses and then specific responses. So if you look on page 58, figure 4.2, you'll see how extroversion can be then subdivided into various traits like sociability, dominance, assertiveness, activity, and liveliness, which would then be further subdivided into habitual responses, which would then further be divided into specific responses. The idea being that it all starts, though, with those 3 super traits, and that the individual behaviors ultimately are reflected in those super traits. Okay. Another approach comes from Wiggins and his colleagues, and it is called the interpersonal circle. It's described on page 59 to 60 in the textbook. The idea being that there are more or less these two core dimensions of personality: your dominance level and dominance and love. So you're either going to be essentially dominant or submissive, cold or warm, anywhere within on a continuum on these particular core traits. And essentially these core traits, more or less your combination of high, middle, or low dominance, high, middle, or low cold-heartedness, or so on, somewhere in between these, within these particular dimensions, the intersection of those kind of really describes your personality. So, for example, someone who would be arrogant and calculating would be on the dominant side of the dominance trait, and would be on the cold-hearted side of the love trait, of the love dimension. Someone who is unassuming and ingenuous would be on the low end, would be on the submissive end of the dominance trait. So they would be submissive. They wouldn't be trying to dominate over people. And they would also be, but they would be high on the love end, so they would be very warm and agreeable. So they would kind of be a nice, kind person, but would be, maybe very shy in that respect. So anyway, so that's just another approach to personality.